Chapter 5 of Operation Terror by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Operation Terror, Chapter 5. When darkness fell, Lockley and Jill were many miles away from the clearing where he had made the SOS. They were under a dense screen of leaves from a monster tree whose roots rose above ground at the foot of its enormous trunk. They formed a shelter of sorts against observation from a distance. Lockley had spotted a fallen tree far gone with wood rot. He broke pieces of the punky stuff with his fingers. Then he realized that without a pot the bracken shoots he'd gathered could not be cooked. They had to be boiled, or not cooked at all. "We'll call it a salad," he told Jill, "minus vinegar and oil and garlic, and eat what we can." She'd been pale with exhaustion before the sun sank, but he hadn't dared let her rest more than was absolutely necessary. Once he'd offered to carry her for a while, but she'd refused. Now she sat drearily in the shelter of the roots, resting. "We might try for news," he suggested. She made an exhausted gesture of assent. He turned on the tiny radio and tuned it in. There was no scarcity of news now. A few days past, news went on the air on schedule, mostly limited to 5-minute periods in which to cover all the noteworthy events of the world. Part of that 5 minutes, too, was taken up by advertising matter from a sponsor. Now music was rare. There were occasional melodies, but most were interrupted for new interpretations of the threat to Earth at Boulder Lake. Every sort of prominent person was invited to air his views about the thing from the sky and the creatures it brought. Most had no views, but only an urge to talk to a large audience. Something, though, had to be put on the air between commercials. The actual news was specific. Small towns around the fringe of the park area were being evacuated of all their inhabitants. Foreign scientists had been flown to the United States and were at the temporary area command post not far from Boulder Lake. Rocket missiles were aimed and ready to blast the lake and the mountains around it should the need arise. A drone plane had been flown to the lake with a television camera, transmitting back everything its lens saw. It arrived at the lake, and its camera relayed back exactly nothing that had not been photographed and recorded before. But suddenly there was a crash of static, and the drone went out of control and crashed. Its camera faithfully transmitted the landscape spinning around until its destruction. Military transmitters were beaming signals on every conceivable frequency to what was now universally called the alien spaceship. They had received no replies. The foreign scientists had agreed that the terror beam, paralysis beam, death beam, was electronic in nature. Lockley had thought Jill asleep from pure weariness, but her voice came out of the darkness beside the big tree trunk. "You found that out," she said, "about its being electronic." "I had a sample stationary beam to check on," said Lockley. "They haven't, which may be a bad thing. Nobody's going to make useful observations of something that makes him blind and deaf and paralyzed while he's in the act." "There are some things that puzzle me about that. Why haven't they killed anybody yet? They've got the public about as scared as it can get without some killing. And why didn't we get the full force of the beam after the plane had been driven away? They could have given us the full treatment if they'd wanted to. Why didn't they?" "If people run away from the towns," said Jill's voice, very tired and sleepy, "maybe they think that's enough. They can take the towns." Lockley did not answer, and Jill said no more. Her breathing became deep and regular. She was so weary that even hunger could not keep her awake. Lockley tried to think. There was the matter of food. Bracken shoots were common enough, but unsubstantial. It would need more careful observation to note all the likely spots for mushrooms. Perhaps they were far enough from the lake to take more time hunting food. They were almost exactly in the situation of Australian bushmen who live exclusively by foraging, with some not too efficient hunting. But Australian savages were not as finicky as Jill and himself. They ate grubs and insects. For this sort of situation, prejudices were a handicap. He considered the idea with sardonic appreciation. 2 days of inadequate food, and such ideas came. But he and Jill wouldn't be the only ones to think such things if matters continued as they were going. The towns around Boulder Lake were being evacuated. The cordon about it had been made to retreat. There was panic not only in America, but everywhere. In Europe, there were wild rumors of other landings of other ships of space. The stock markets would undoubtedly close tomorrow, if they hadn't closed today. There'd be the beginning of a mass exodus from the larger cities, starting quietly but building up to frenzy as those who tried to leave jammed all the routes by which they could get away. If the creatures of the spaceship wanted more than the flight of all humans from about their landing place, there would be genuine trouble. Let them move aggressively, and there would be panic and disorder and pure catastrophe, with self-exiled city-dwellers desperate from hunger because they were away from market centers. It looked as if a dozen or two monsters could wreck a civilization without the need to kill one single human being directly. He heard a sound. He turned off the radio, gripping the clumsy club which was probably useless against anything really threatening. The sound continued. There were rustlings of leaves, and then faint rattling, almost clicking noises. Whatever the creature was, it was not large. It seemed to amble tranquilly through the forest and the night, neither alarmed nor considering itself alarming. The clickings again, and suddenly Lockley knew what it was. Of course, he'd heard it in the compost pit shell, when he was a prisoner of the invaders from space. He rose and moved toward the noise. The creature did not run away. It went about its own affairs with the same peaceful indifference as before. Lockley ran into a tree. He stumbled over a fallen branch on the ground. He came to the place where the creature should be. There was silence. He flicked the flint of his pocket-lighter, and in the flash of brightness he saw his prey. It had heard his approach. It was a porcupine, prudently curled up into a spiky ball, and placidly defying all carnivores, including men. A porcupine is normally the one wild creature without an enemy. Even men customarily spare it because so often it has saved the lives of lost hunters and half-starved travelers. It accomplishes this by its bland refusal to run away from anybody. Lockley classed himself as a half-starved traveler. He struck with the club after a second spark from his lighter flint. Presently he had a small, barely smoldering fire of rotted wood. He cooked over it, and the smell of cooking roused Jill from her exhausted slumber. "What?" "We're having a late supper," said Lockley gravely. "A midnight snack. Take this stick. There's a loin of porcupine on it. Be careful, it's hot." Jill said, "Oh." Then, "Is there more for you?" "Plenty," he assured her. "I hunted it down with my trusty club, and only got stuck a half-dozen times while I was skinning and cleaning it." She ate avidly, and when she'd finished he offered more, which she refused until he'd had a share. They did not quite finish the whole porcupine, but it was an odd and companionable meal, there in the darkness, with the barely glowing coals well hidden from sight. Lockley said, "I'm sort of a news addict. Shall we see what the wild radio waves are saying?" "Of course," said Jill. She added awkwardly, "Maybe it's the sudden food, but I hope you'll remain my friend after this is all over. I don't know anyone else I'd say that to." "Consider," said Lockley, that I've made an eloquent and grateful reply." But his expression in the darkness was not happy. He'd fallen in love with Jill after meeting her only twice, and both times she had been with Vale. She intended to marry Vale. But on the evidence at hand, Vale was either dead or a prisoner of the invaders. If the last, his chances of living to marry Jill did not look good, and if the first, this was surely no time to revive his memory. He found a news broadcast. He suspected that most radio stations would stay on the air all night, now that it was officially admitted that the object in Boulder Lake was a spaceship bringing invaders to Earth. The government releases spoke of them as visitors, in a belated use of the term, but the public was suspicious of reassurances now. At the beginning, the landing had seemed like another exaggerated horror tale of the kind that kept up newspaper circulations. Now the public was beginning to believe it, and people might stop going to their offices, and the trains might cease to run on time. When that happened, disaster would be at hand. The news came in a resonant voice which revealed these facts. 4 more small towns had been ordered evacuated because of their proximity to Boulder Lake. The radiation weapon of the aliens had pushed back the military cordon by as much as 5 miles. But the big news was that the aliens had broken radio silence. Apparently, they'd examined and repaired the shortwave communicator from the helicopter they'd knocked down. Shortly after sundown, said the news report, a call had come through on a military shortwave frequency. It was a human voice, first muttering bewilderedly and then speaking with confusion and uneasiness. The message had been taped and now was released to the public. "What the hell's this? Oh, what do you characters want me to do? This feels like the shortwave set from the copter. You've got it turned on. What'll I do with it? Broadcast? I don't know whether you want me to talk to you or to back home, wherever that is. Maybe you want me to say I'm having a fine time and wish you was here. I'm not. I wish I was there. If this is going on the air, I'm Joe Blake, radio man on the copter 211. We're heading to Boulder Lake when I smelled a stink. Next second, there were lights in my eyes. They blinded me. Then I heard a racket like all hell was loose. Then I felt like I had hold of a power transmission line. I couldn't wiggle a finger. I stayed that way till the copter crashed. When I came to, I was blindfolded, like I am now. I don't know what happened to the other guys. I haven't seen 'em. I haven't seen anything. But they just put me in front of what I think is the copter shortwave set and squeaked at me." The recorded voice ended abruptly. The news announcer's voice came back. He said that the member of the copter crew had given some other information before he was arbitrarily cut off. "I'll bet," said Lockley when the newscast ended, "I'll bet the other information was that the invaders have managed to tell him that the Earth must surrender to them." "Why?" "What else would they want to say? To come and play patty-cake, when they can push the army around at will and have managed to keep planes from flying anywhere near them? They may not know we've got atom bombs, but I'll bet they do. Part of that extra information could have been a warning not to try to use them. It would be logical to bluff even on that, though they couldn't make good." Jill said, very carefully, "You hinted once that they might be men, pretending to be monsters. But that would mean that somebody I care about would probably be killed, because he'd seen them and knew they weren't creatures from beyond the stars." "I think you can forget that idea," said Lockley. "They don't act like men. Chasing away the plane that was going to land for us, and not using the beam on the fugitives it was plainly going to land for. That's not like men preparing to take over a continent. And nudging the army back to make the cordon space larger? That's not like our most likely human enemy, either. They'd wipe out the cordon by stepping up the terror beam to death-ray intensity." "Suppose they couldn't?" "They wouldn't have landed with a weapon that couldn't kill anybody," said Lockley. It's much more likely that they're monsters. But they don't act like monsters either." Jill was silent for a moment. "Not even monsters who wanted to make friends?" "They," said Lockley dryly, "would hardly make a surprise landing. They'd have parked on the moon and squeaked at us until we got curious, and then they'd arrange to land, or to meet men in orbit or something. But they didn't. They made a surprise landing, and cleared a big space of humans, keeping themselves to themselves. But if they do think we're animals, like rabbits, they'd kill people instead of stinging them up a bit, or paralyzing them for a while and then letting them go. That's not like any monster I can imagine." "Then you'd better go to sleep," said Lockley. "We've got a long day's hike before us tomorrow." "Yes," agreed Jill reluctantly. "Good night." "Night," said Lockley curtly. He stayed awake. It was amusing that he was uneasy about wild animals. There were predators in the park, and he had only an improvised club for a weapon. But he knew well enough that most animals avoid man because of a bewildering sudden development of instinct. Grizzly bears, before the white man came, were so scornful of man that they could be considered the dominant species in North America. They'd been known to raid a camp of Indians to carry away a man for food. Indian spears and arrows were simply ineffective against them. When Stonewall Jackson was a lieutenant in the United States Army, stationed in the West to protect the white settlers, he and a detachment of mounted troopers were attacked without provocation by a grizzly who was wholly contemptuous of them. The then Lieutenant Jackson rode a horse which was blind in one eye, and he maneuvered to get the bear on the horse's blind side so he could charge it. With his cavalry saber he split the grizzly's skull down to its chin. It was the only time in history that a grizzly bear was ever killed by a man with a sword. But no grizzly nowadays would attack a man unless cornered. Even cubs with no possible experience of humankind are terrified by the scent of men. All that was true enough. In addition, preparations for the park included much activity by the Wildlife Control Unit, which persuaded bears to congregate in one area by putting food out for them, and took various other measures for deer and other animals. It had seeded trout streams with fingerlings and the lake itself with baby big-mouthed bass. The huge trailer truck of Wildlife Control was familiar enough. Lockley had seen it headed up to the lake the day before the landing. Now he found himself wondering sardonically to what degree the Wildlife Control men determined where the mountain lions should hunt. He'd slept in the open innumerable times without thinking of mountain lions. With Jill to look after, though, he worried. But he was horribly weary, and he knew somehow that in the back of his mind there was something unpleasant that was trying to move into his conscious thoughts. It was a sort of hunch. Wearily and half asleep, he tried to put his mind on it. He failed. He awoke suddenly. There were rustlings among the trees. Something moved slowly and intermittently toward him. It could be anything, even a creature from Boulder Lake. He heard other sounds. Another creature. The first one drew near, not moving in a straight line. The second creature followed it, drawing closer to the first. Lockley's scalp crawled. Creatures from space might have some of the highly developed senses which men had lost while growing civilized, full keenness of scent, for example. Such a creature might be able to find Lockley and Jill in the darkness after trailing them for miles. And so primitive a talent in a creature farther advanced than men was somehow more horrifying than anything else Lockley had thought of about them. He gripped his club desperately, wholly aware that a star creature should be able to paralyze him with the terror beam. There were whistling, squealing noises. They were very much like the squeaks his captors had directed at each other and at him when he was blindfolded and being led downhill to imprisonment in the compost pit shell. Very much like, but not identical. Nevertheless, Lockley's hair seemed to stand up on end, and he raised his club in desperation. The whistling squeals grew shriller. Then there was an indescribable sound, and one of the two creatures rushed frantically away. It traveled in great leaps through the blackness under the trees. And then there was a sudden whiff of a long familiar odor, smelled 100 times before. It was the reek of a skunk, stalked by a carnivore and defending itself as skunks do. But a skunk was nothing like a terror beam. Its effluvium offended only one sense, affected only one set of sensation nerves. The terror beam. Lockley opened his mouth to laugh, but did not. The thing at the back of his mind had come forward. He was appalled. Jill said shakily, "What's the matter? What's happened? That smell—" "It's only a skunk," said Lockley evenly. "He just told me some very bad news. I know how the terror beam works now, and there's not a thing that can be done about it. Not a thing. It can't be." He raged suddenly, there in the darkness, because he saw the utter hopelessness of combating the creatures who'd taken over Boulder Lake. There was nothing to keep them from taking over the whole Earth, no matter what sort of monsters, or not monsters, they might be. End of Chapter 5.